Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our presentation this afternoon. Very excited that you've joined us to help celebrate Women's History Month at Historic Fort Steilacoom with our virtual program. Today, we're really excited to have as our speaker Claire Keller-Scholz, who will be speaking to us on her presentation, In Her Shoes, Tracing the Footsteps of Pierce County Women in the Mid-1800's. So just to give you a little bit of background information, Claire is a public historian, formerly the curator at Fort Nisqually Living History Museum, and currently she's serving in the planning department with Metro Parks Tacoma in a public history role. I can say that having worked with Claire for quite some time, I know that this is a topic that she's very knowledgeable about and passionate about as well. So I'm excited to hear what she has to say today. Just before we get started, I wanted to mention we appreciate so much your support of Historic Fort Steilacoom. As a nonprofit organization, our mission is sharing and preserving the first U.S. Army post in the Puget Sound region with area guests. And your attendance in this program today certainly helps to support our organization and help us to achieve our mission. So thank you all very much. I also wanted to mention that you can find out more information about our ongoing events by visiting our website, which is historicfortsteilacoom.org. And please do take time to like us on our social media pages, Facebook and Instagram, and share those whenever you have an opportunity. We are going to be recording, and I think we are currently recording this program.
There we go. Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen. And as Jim mentioned, there will be a chance for question and answer at the end. I am fortunate to have been involved with Fort Nisqually for a number of years. And over that time, I got to work with and learn from a number of very talented historians. And so this presentation is the results of work, not just from my own research, but from many other historians that I've worked with. So we're going to go through it. And because I know many of you are knowledgeable about the history, at the end, there'll definitely be a time to share your own experiences of women's history in this area. So just real quick, as I mentioned, I've been privileged to work with and learn from a number of historians, many of them women. So a shout out to Emma Milliken, Chris Erlich, Nancy Keller-Scholz, and my curator mentor, Bill Rind, for all the research that they've done on this topic. As we go through, I wanted to kind of frame this conversation in recognizing that women's history is all of our history. I think we oftentimes buy into kind of the Victorian mythos of like the domestic sphere, where women lived in this very narrow bubble of influence and didn't really impact larger trends in history. We know that to be false. And so I'd like you to think about women as active participants and shapers of history as we go through this presentation. This is a picture of Catherine McLeod Mounts, who we'll talk about more as we get along here. But it's a great picture of her and her baskets and a representation of women as carriers of culture and history. So this presentation emerged from an exhibit that Chris Erlich and I did for Fort Nisqually Living History Museum back in 2016. And so most of what we're going to talk about is Fort Nisqually centric. There's so many great stories about women in this area in the mid-1800s to talk about, but we're going to kind of focus on the Fort Nisqually and environs. So this is what you would have seen had you been here in Pierce County in the 1840s and 50s. This, of course, is Fort Nisqually before the Palisades were up in that period. And there, look around, most of the women on Puget Sound at that time were Native American. I'll take this moment to acknowledge that we are currently on Indigenous land. I am in Steilacoom, which is and was the original homeland of the Steilacoom people, who are signers of the Medicine Creek Treaty and are still here. In the 1850s, you had primarily Native American women, and they were active participants in not only domestic life, but also in this commercial economic sphere. So throughout the fur trade, of course, Native American women played an important role as connectors, as translators, as guides, as social cohesion. Like they've helped meld fur trade society with the native cultures and villages and life that was currently happening on Puget Sound. As we know, Sacagawea, Sacagawea played a vital role with Lewis and Clark, being that bridge and being that guide. To a lesser degree, but perhaps more prevalent, women acted as that bridge between European fur traders and the locals. They spoke multiple languages. They helped build social ties with villages by intermarriage. So a fur trader would marry the daughter of a local chief, and that would connect him with his family and give him access to more trade and to protection. When in the early days, Native Americans vastly outnumbered the Europeans. So it wasn't just, one-offs here and there. It was very much the fabric of the local scene at the time was mixed marriages. These produced mixed race individuals known as Métis. Out here, we use what I think of as a lowercase Métis to describe the mixed race individuals. Métis is a recognized category of First Nations in Canada. However, here on Puget Sound, it is a more general term. It does not refer to a very specific kind of cultural identity as it does up there. This is a picture of Catherine McLeod Mounts as a younger woman with her 2 children. And she was the child of a husband company employee, John McLeod, who was Scottish, and a Native American mother. She grew up on the Sound and raised her family here. Women like Catherine were also employed directly by the fur trade at their posts. So Fort Vancouver, Fort Nisqually, all these other little farms like Cowlitz Farm hired Native American women as part of their labor force. Native American men and women worked on the farms performing a variety of roles, and were, again, that essential piece of the economic engine of the fur trade, and of course cultural focus that emerged here on the Sound in the 1840s and 50s. There are lots of entries in the Journal of Occurrences talking about the women working in the fields with the sheep, taking care of the shearing. They helped weed gardens, they helped harvest produce, they did everything that the men did in the fields. They also performed more what we think of as domestic tasks, not only for their families, but also for the company at large, making food, performing laundry for individuals. This was, of course, more common if you had a single man working at the fort without his own wife to take care of the work. He would hire a native woman or any of the employees' wives who wanted to make some extra money, and they would be able to help out with that. No one likes to do laundry. That's just kind of a fact of life, right? There were a handful of Anglo-European women who were here on the Sound at this time. This is prior to the surge of immigration overland from the Americans. But we had a couple of English women who came with their husbands to work for Fort Nisqually and Puget Sound Agricultural Company. Emma Kedge Thornhill and Emily Dean. You may be familiar with those names, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we get along. But I wanted to paint the big picture, and then we'll get into more details about these women's lives. So more of the tasks that they may have done on the farm included repairing gunny sacks, braiding rope out of hide. They planted thick sorted potatoes, they washed wool, they sheared sheep, they harvested oats, they dusted furs. On the fur trade trail, they were often the ones scraping the hides and preparing those for being packed and hauled around. So again, the women's work was certainly not just in the home. It was part of the overall economic engine. And they also purchased goods. The women who worked at Fort Nisqually received credit in the sale shop, and they were able to purchase their own goods, including lots of home goods. Look at the clothes that Catherine Mounts is wearing there. She could have bought the fabric from the sale shop. She could have bought the decorations, the earrings, all of the notions for sewing, as well as shawls, blankets, and cookware as well. As we kind of mentioned, like the fur trade era was really where Native American women and mixed race women had this very high social capital. It was to the fur traders' advantage to marry into the tribes. And when the Hudson's Bay Company arrived, they very much practiced that. Even in the 1840s, when again, the Fort Nisqually focus shifted to agriculture, it was still to the advantage of the employees to form these unions with local women. However, in the 1850s, with increasing American immigration, this changed and the women's roles shifted somewhat. They were no longer the vital connections between the Native Americans and the Europeans, but became kind of this awkward, neither fitting in neither world. And it became more of a challenge for them to balance their identities as Native Americans with European ancestry or vice versa. They didn't fit in either world and they had to choose in a lot of ways. So we'll talk now about some of the women who were featured in the exhibit In Her Shoes, and starting out with women who really emerged from these early fur trading unions specifically. So Catherine Tumult Ross was one of these women who was the child of a Hudson's Bay Company employee and a Native American woman. She was the daughter of an Iroquois Hudson's Bay Company employee who came over with the company from central Canada. Her father was Thomas Towakan and her mother was Chinook, who lived with Chinook people farther south here. Catherine was raised by her father primarily and married another Hudson's Bay Company employee, Thomas Davis first, who was a sailor. That marriage did not last very long. Then she married Andre Saint-Martin, who was the French-Canadian employee who was also here for the Hudson's Bay Company. They married in 1838. So this is still that early era when it was primarily just fur traders in the Pierce County, Puget Sound region. And so it was a much bigger advantage for him to marry Catherine as a member of the Chinook Nation to help navigate those social relationships. They moved around with the work with Hudson's Bay Company. They worked at Fort Nisqually for a time, and then Andre settled on a land claim. He also worked at Kellett's farm. And so she was a farmer's wife, but also a member of the Chinook Nation, and she retained that Native American identity. Her son Isidore was a prominent leader of that community, kind of that French Canadian and Métis community near Cowlett's farm. Her descendants are still in the Cowlett's tribe. And so we'll talk a little bit more about them later. But I wanted to mention another Catherine we do not have a picture of. Catherine, sorry, that was Catherine Tawakan. And then the picture in here is Catherine Tumult. So we don't have pictures of Catherine Tawakan, but we do have pictures of Catherine Tumult, who was again the daughter of a Native American woman and an Iroquois Hudson's Bay Company employee. So Catherine's mother was Nisqually, Quaton, and her father, Louis Tumult, was Iroquois. She married Charlie Ross Jr., who was himself Métis, and he is the one in that fabulous Highland regalia in the photo. Her descendants live in the Nisqually tribe. So again, with these earlier relationships, earlier marriages, the Native American identity was much stronger for these women in many ways. because they were able to retain that and didn't face the same pressures that later women faced in terms of choosing their identity. Charlie Ross Jr., he was, as I mentioned, Métis himself. His father, George Ross, I'm sorry if I missed that name, that's Charlie Ross Sr., was a prominent Hudson's Bay Company officer, and Walter and Charlie were the children there. They went to England to be educated, actually. So he's wearing regalia. He was in England, we know, to be educated. We're not sure if he got to Scotland, but he brought that identity back with him and was able to maintain both his Scottish heritage as well as his Nisqually heritage. He ended up living on the reservation with Catherine and her family, and that is where their descendants still live. Okay, and of course, most of us are familiar with the work Tolmie and Huggins families. These are that kind of middle phase in my mind where the mother, Josette Lagacé work, was part French Canadian and part Nez Perce Spokane Indian. Her father, then their father, Letitia, Jane, Sarah, Mary, Margaret, and I'm sure I'm missing more of the work daughters. They experienced the second generation kind of Métis who were able to use their father's social standing as a way to navigate this identity. And so they were able to, in many ways, kind of assimilate to the European society and lean heavily on that as their identity to navigate this new world. So they were growing up in the 1840s and 50s. In the 50s, Jane worked Tolmie, married William Fraser Tolmie, raised her family at Fort Nisqually. Letitia Work Huggins married Edward Huggins and was able to make a home here on Puget Sound at the fort when it became a homestead after the business closed down and moved north of the border to Canada. And so, whereas the Catherines, Catherine Tawakan and Catherine Tumult, ended up living with their tribal families, the Work, Tolmie, and Huggins families, those daughters and wives ended up living more in the American world. So here we have some lovely pictures of Jane and her daughters, May, Jean, and Anne. And then Josette Lagacé worked, there we go, with her youngest children, Suzanne and David. I believe Suzanne is also known as Suzette or Josette. That is a typo, so please excuse that. And then we kind of have this latest, the end stage of the Fort children, as I think of them, that these are the women of Fort employees who were growing up at the Fort in the 1840s and 50s and had much more of that American experience. So Elizabeth Jalafu is the daughter of Jean-Baptiste Jalafu, who was a blacksmith. He was a man about town. He was a man of many trades, is what I meant to say there, and did odd jobs throughout the fort, both as a Hudson's Bay Company employee and then as a Puget Sound Agricultural Company employee as well. Kind of, he actually had a contract with Hudson's Bay Company in 1851, despite the fact that it was primarily an agricultural center at that point. But he was one of those Hudson's Bay Company French Canadians who kind of did odd jobs for most of his career and then settled on the plains around the fort. His daughter Elizabeth was actually born in Alaska when Jean-Baptiste was posted to a fur trade post up there. And she was known as Betsy, but Elizabeth was her given name. Her father, again, was Jean-Baptiste Jalafu, and her mother was Eunice Mooch, who was also called Harriet. She was the daughter of Tawisna, a Clallam Indian, and the Cowlitz chief Scowena. So there was a Native American family that was actually pretty prominent here in the fur trade of Fort Nisqually and Puget Sound. Cowlitz chief Scowenas had another daughter who was the mother of Janet Young's mom. So there are some cousins here that we have reinforcing the family connections that were so pivotal for the Native American relationships in this area. So, sorry, actually that was McLeod Mounts, not Janet Young, but I'll talk more about her later and we'll untangle the family trees. Suffice to say, tribal identities as we know them today are largely a creation of the treaty era. And prior to that, you had smaller bands, you had specific identities of tribes, but they were not defined the same way as we think of them today. So you had a lot of these connections and intermarriages and interactions between the tribes that we see as we try to trace the heritage of many of the individuals who grew up around the fort. So Elizabeth Betsy, she was born in Alaska and she lived in this area in the 1850s. Her sister Josephine lived with her as well. Jean Baptiste had several different wives, and so the girls, their mother died in 1840s, 50s. Their father remarried. It was not necessarily a happy home, and the girls experienced some mistreatment by their stepmother, at which point Mrs. Tolmie stepped in. Jane Tolmie took an interest in the girls and sent them to Victoria for education in the 1850s. They returned after a short time, and Elizabeth did actually end up marrying one of the soldiers posted to Fort Steilacoom. So Thomas Jefferson Carroll was an American who came with the army. He abandons his family in 1865 or 1860. She remarries in 1865 to an American immigrant, Henry Smith. And as you can see in this picture, she had a large family. She had many children and many grandchildren as well. And her descendants are still in this area and were able to contribute to the exhibit. Alice Harrison, who provided this photo, also provided a basket for our exhibit. Janet Young is a familiar name to many of those who have been to Fort Nisqually or have participated in our programming. Again, her father was an employee of Hudson's Bay Company, I think actually PSAC, the Puget Sound Agricultural Company primarily, and he raised Janet after her Snohomish mother returned to her tribe after 7 years. Janet went by a number of names, as many of these women did, but Janet was born in 1856. So she is kind of the end of the fur trade, end of the Fort Nisqually era of children who grew up in that mixed world. She was born in the middle of the Puget Sound Treaty Wars, and actually, according to family story and the material evidence that we have, she was born at Fort Nisqually in the granary, where the family was taking shelter as a result of these tensions on Puget Sound. So her story is very much integral to the overall story of Puget Sound and how it was changing. Her mother, Jane Snohomish, or Yasolitsa, was living with William Benston here on the Sound for a number of years, and that was William Young is her dad. Here you go. All right. The fun part about doing this history is the names, because there are so many people who are named after family members that it really takes some time to drill into and unpick who is who. So Janet Young, Benston Miller, reflects her marriages. Her father was William Gillian Young. His name was actually William Gillian, but he was known as Young William, so everyone started calling him William Young. Then you have other Gillian family members who were also named William and Janet, adding to the confusion when you get into the genealogy. But Janet married William Benston, whose father was Adam Benston. Adam Benston Sr.'s brother was William Benston. Adam Benston's children were William and Adam. Janet married William, and they lived in this area with both Adams and both Williams marrying women. So if you go to the cemetery where Janet Young is buried, there is another Janet Young fenced who is not this one. She was like a wife of possibly Adam. No. There's a tree there that is fun, but a little complicated when it gets to figuring out descendants and antecedents. Janet, as I mentioned, was raised by her father, so she learned about the Scottish heritage he brought with him. She learned how to dance the Highland Fling. She learned how to read and write. She learned how to knit and to make shawls and can fruit, take care of the animals. But she also remembered her mother. And her mother was a woman who kind of embodied what it meant to be part of the well-rounded sphere. You had women who were taking care of animals as well as the home. And Yasolitsa Snohomish was able to shoot a muskrat in the eye at 20 paces, ride like the wind on a bareback pony, and can paddle a kayak canoe through the choppiest of Puget Sound waters. So these women were certainly not stuck in the home and were certainly more than the domestic goddesses that Victorians might like to pretend that they were. How do we know what we know? It goes back to the many sources of records. Women were educated, but not to the same degree as men. And so a large part of what we know comes from other people's depictions of them. This is a picture of the Ptolemy family of a Cloverdale. As you can see, there's Ptolemy and Jane and their many children. And we know about these women from the letters that their husbands and fathers wrote, but we also know about them through their own actions. So on this page, you'll see a screenshot of a microfilm page from the Indian Shop Blotter, which shows the women earning their pay as credit in the sale shop through those farm chores I mentioned earlier. They were often the wives of the Native American employees and the HBC employees, European employees. And they were also, daughters or other cousins, family members of those who worked for the company. One of the few women who had her own accounts under her name in the sale shop books was Anne Forrest. Her father was a Hudson Bay Company employee. He passed away, and then kind of her estate was taken care of by Reverend Staines at Fort Vancouver. So she was kind of still on the payroll, so to speak, even though it was her family, not her. But she was one of the few women that we know who had their own account and were not just given credit for a daily work or lumped in with their families. The little bags there you'll see on the picture are powdered pouches of powdered vermilion. And this is a paint pigment powder, which was a common traded commodity in the fur trade. It was used by Native American peoples as part of social and ceremonial decorations. So body paint for different patterns on your face or other parts of your body. It was very popular among Native peoples in the fur trade. And these particular pouches were kept by Josette Work as a memento, I believe, of her time on the fur trade trail and an acknowledgement of her own Native American roots. She kept these pouches as well as scraps of moccasin makings and beads in her box, and she kept them as she traveled around, in which, coming from Eastern Washington, traveling to Fort Vancouver, traveling to Fort Nisqually, traveling to Fort Victoria. If you think about it, you only keep what is meaningful to you when you move that much. So the fact that she did keep these with her says a lot about what it meant to these women to have these mixed identities. We know about this because of Letitia telling her daughter-in-law, Anne Huggins, about these stories. So although it was often the men writing about their wives and daughters, and that's how we know about these women's stories, it was also women telling their family members, and then the later generations writing these reminiscences down. So Letitia kept the material from her mother, and then when she had married Edward Huggins and lived at the fort site in the late 1800s, she passed on the stories to Anne, and Anne recorded them in letters to her friends, and that is how we know some of the stories that we know. You'll see those beads there, the necklace. That is another piece of material culture that was passed down in the family, and that comes from Catherine McLeod Mounts. So I mentioned earlier the complicated family relationships here. Catherine was the daughter of John McLeod, a Hudson Bay Company employee. Her mother was Claquadot, also known as Mary, and this is the woman who was the daughter of Cowlitz Chief Scanawa. So Catherine was a cousin to Betsy Chalafu. So Betsy was born in 1840s. Catherine was born much later. Well, not much later. So they were contemporaries, they were cousins. And once again, speaking to that network of family relationships here. This necklace then was passed down through the Mounts family. Daniel Mounts was an Indian agent with the Nisqually, and so Catherine and Daniel lived on the Nisqually Reservation. And of course, one of the primary ways of learning this history is through those oral transmissions and family stories. So we are fortunate enough to have information from family descendants. So we have a small picture there of Catherine Huggins Johnstone. Below is Judy Bridges, and right is Alice Harrison. Judy Bridges is a descendant of a number of fur trade families, but specifically Catherine Tawakan, and the San Martin family. So when Catherine married Andre, their son Isidore was a prominent member of the Cowlitz community, and the family was able to share those stories and share that heritage. And we are very lucky to have Judy Bridges as a longtime supporter and volunteer at Fort Nisqually, sharing not only her skills in basketry, but also her knowledge of Chinook jargon and other cultural traditions from the Cowlitz people. Alice Harrison is a descendant of the Chalafu family from Betsy through her son, William. And she did not know of her heritage for a number of years. She kind of came into that knowledge later in her life, and then decided to investigate the traditions of her family and got into basketry. So here she is showing how to strip the cedar from a tree for basket weaving. She spent a lot of time kind of learning how to do traditional basketry, not only with traditional material, but also with modern material. So if you're interested in the end, I can kind of add some resources for what her work looks like. She has some online, as well as we have some photos at Fort Nisqually when we were able to borrow a basket for our exhibit. And so it is a matter of peering through kind of what we think of as traditional history to be able to pull out this knowledge of women's history. And that largely comes from relationships of family members to their heritage, and to looking through their record, because even though Native American women do not necessarily have their own accounts in the account books, they are mentioned by name. Women were, again, active participants in all aspects of the fur trade, and certainly were active agents and participants in their own life here on the Puget Sound in the 1800s. Okay. So there are so many great stories to tell about these women, and I didn't want to kind of get into too much of them, because where do you stop? So that's kind of an overview of what it was like on the Puget Sound. It was a matter of navigating mixed worlds. These women often had Native American mothers, but increasingly in the 1850s, it was seen as a negative thing to have Native American ancestry. And so the women were pressured, sometimes by their families, sometimes from a desire to have a stable life, to adopt kind of the Western attitudes, including dress and language. But for those who grew up in the 1850s, they oftentimes were able to retain elements of their Native past. So when we mentioned Letitia work keeping her mother's moccasins and vermilion paint and beadwork. Jane and Letitia both spoke multiple Native American languages, and Catherine McLeod Mounts kept her necklace. You remember from the beginning, she learned to make baskets and continued that Native heritage with her family. She again lived on the Nisqually Reservation with the Mounts family. Here on the screen, you'll see a lot of other women who also were active participants in the world of the 1800s. Katie Counts, that's a name that you may be familiar with if you are from this area. There are many Puyallup tribal members in Nisqually who have Counts heritage. Mrs. Colonel Silas Casey was an active participant in the Fort Nisqually community and was known among the local social set as the gracious hostess. The Tolmeys and the Caseys often had social visits with each other. And Helene McDonald Kitson, she grew up at Fort Nisqually, and her husband for a time, Helene is the mother, her children grew up at Fort Nisqually, and then also lived at Cowlitz Farm and were social correspondents with the Tolmey family as well. So all of these people knew each other, and there's a lot of back and forth intercourse. I will make a note that despite all of this, this goodwill, we have lots of quotes from the men about their husband, about their wives. So Edward Huggins he says, I consider myself very fortunate to get so good a young woman for a wife about Letitia. Dr. Tolmey described his wife as good and large-hearted. John Work described his wife thusly saying, she is to me an affectionate partner, simple and uninstructed as she is, and takes good care of my children and myself. Captain William McNeil, who was a Hudson's Bay Company employee, although he was an American, was in charge of the steamship Beaver for a time. And of his mixed race wife, actually he was Haida, excuse me, he said, I good and faithful partner to me for 30 years, a most kind mother to her children. No woman could have done her duty better. So there was genuine affection of these men for their wives. And I would add a little tangent here that while wife and motherhood, like those were your kind of career goals as a woman at this time, they weren't the same kind of powerless like pawns that we sort of think of women at the time. Letitia had a number of opportunities to marry as the daughter of John Work, who was a prominent fur trader, but she chose Edward Huggins. So there was some element of free will. It wasn't just economic stability, whoever offers a good opportunity, but there was genuine affection on the part of these women. And they were able to choose their marriages in some cases. I also wanted to note that despite, again, the fur trade advantages and that practice, the women faced discrimination because of their mixed race heritage in many cases. There's kind of a startling quote from Herbert Bancroft, who was one of the local historians here, that specifically kind of calls out, he says, you know, I can't believe that these Hudson's Bay Company men had to endure marrying Native women or mixed race women. He thinks that they are the cream of the crop and had a great, deal going. They were well-respected officers in the Hudson's Bay Company, and yet, here's the quote. It has always seemed to me that the heaviest penalty of the servant of the Hudson's Bay Company were obliged to pay for the wealth and authority advancement given them was the wives they were expected to marry and the progeny they should rear. I can never understand how such men as John McLaughlin, James Douglas, Ogden, Finlayson, Work, and Tolmey, and the rest could endure the thought of having their name and honors descend to a degenerate posterity. This was Herbert Howe Bancroft, who wrote books about Pacific Northwest history, and yet, as a man in the 1880s, from this territorial perspective, he couldn't understand, why this was not just a stain on the reputation of the Tolmey, Work, Huggins families, knowing that they had this mixed race, future descendants. So as much as we kind of think about the fur trade as a really harmonious blend of cultures, at the same time, there's certainly a dark side to it. Katie Counts, who I mentioned here briefly, Lieutenant Counts abandoned her and his children when he was called back to fight in the Civil War. He knew his real life back in the East Coast, and civilization would not permit him to have an Indian family. And so he chose to have them taken care of here by giving their responsibility to his peers out here to take care of them. But at the same time, it wasn't going to work in his society. So there's a lot there, and I apologize if I went kind of fast, but I wanted to have this time to really chat about these women and about stories that you're interested in hearing. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I want to open it up to some questions. And what do you know about women at this time in history and in this area, and what do you want to know more about? So Walter, if you want to unmute, if people want to raise their hands, we can do it that way, or you can just kind of turn on your camera and then we'll know that you have something to add.
Yeah, I've marked it so people can unmute themselves, but of course, Zoom
Claire?
Zoom.
Yes.
Oh, there we go.
This is Joe. Did they have the tradition then of when a man married a woman that all of her possessions then belonged to the husband?
No, not necessarily. Women were able to own their own material. I think it depends. So first of all, there wasn't a lot of legal structures on Pierce County at this time.
Mm-hmm.
Women weren't allowed to own their own businesses as such in the territory, but they did own their own property. For example, Anne Forrest, who I mentioned had her own account, she was left that by her father. So her father's estate came to her as her own property. I don't know enough about the legal aspects of it, but I do know that women, retain their own property to a certain degree. Native American women, again, it wasn't just that all of their property then was their husband's. There's a great notation in the Journal of Occurrences where I'm going to pull it up because it's great. It's a quote. 1838, so this is the 1830s, and reporting kind of a disagreement between the locals. The journal notes, quote, "The old Puyallup has been ill-used this day. The scamp Tomas Chum broke a gun belonging to her in revenge because she did not look on him as her husband." So there's an example of, I don't know, sexual harassment, but an individual, one of the locals, took this woman's gun and broke it because he wouldn't go out with him. So people don't really change over history, but it also gives us documentation that women, again, were active participants in all aspects of their lives, and they did own firearms, and they did use them for hunting and for protection as well. Any other questions?
I have one, and then folks, if you can't unmute yourselves, please just signal me. I'm smacking buttons, but you never know if it'll work. You made a reference. Thank you for this, by the way. This is great. I feel like it took a lot of detective work to collect all this, and I know you and a lot of people have been involved in that. The person who could shoot the muskrat at so many. How do we know that? Was that a letter from a family member, or what was the source of it?
That was oral history that was passed down among the Benston family.
Nice.
So I saw in the chat that one of our participants here was helping out with that detective work and the genealogy of untangling the threads there. So Marianne, do you have any memories of working with the family that you would like to share? There might be a mute problem. You might have to help her out there.
There. I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me okay? I went to school with some of the Benston family descendants, and they took me through the graveyard, and we started trying to untangle it, and spent a lot of time in the Secretary of State's database trying to figure out birth dates, because there was, William would name his children Adam and William, and Adam would name his children's Adam and William, and they did that for generations. And it was pretty thorny getting through it all. Finally, somebody named their kid Thomas, but
A little bit of variety there.
but that's not, this is about women, not about Thomas. But as you go down the families of women, the great granddaughter had no idea that Thomas had run whiskey during the Prohibition, and and that barn wasn't full of hay. But it's an interesting wild country out here. I live in Spanaway, so I'm out amongst, even my next door neighbor turned out to be a descendant of the Smiths. That picture had Elizabeth in it, and Clarence, her son Clarence, is the great grandfather of my next door neighbors in the 80s. So kind of fun when you just trip over this stuff. It's in your face when you live out here.
Yes. I will say, so the Dean family, I mentioned in passing Emily Dean, who is a whole character in of herself. So she was one of these English women who came over with her husband to work for the company. She and her husband were kind of notorious as squatters. They were actually hired to take over for Dr. Tolmie in the early 50s, but local management quickly realized they were not really up to that task. So they were assigned to work at Muck Farm. And at Muck, after a while, they decided they didn't want to work for the company anymore, and they were just going to farm it as their own property. So there was some legal work that went back and forth, petitions by Tolmie to get them off. First time he won, second time he lost, due to the shifting dynamics of the territory. But Emily was one of these larger-than-life characters who got her name into the record by threatening employees in the Hudson Company, brandishing firearms and clubs, and threatening to burn down the farm, swearing at them in such detail that, the people who were recording it were like, she is not fit company for Indian women. This woman is crazy. And so she eventually moved. Actually, she and her husband ended up in Oregon for a while. Then she ended up in an insane asylum in California. So we were not the only ones to think that she was a little bit off her rocker. Side note, women were often thought of as crazy just when they didn't fit social conventions. So we don't really know what happened there. But back to Pierce County, her children, again, Aubrey and George Dean, lived in Spanaway area, and they married Métis women and had families who are still here. There's a great picture. I think it might be maybe from your blog, Marianne, or one of our local historians' blogs. But I have it in my notes just as a kind of a reference. So none of these images are owned by me, and please do use credit whenever you know it when sharing them. And if you're going to make a book or something, please search out the archives and get permission to do that. But for this kind of an educational talk, I'm going to go ahead and pull up a picture of the Dean family and their pet bear. Let me see if I can get it here. So, are you seeing the picture there?
Yes.
All right, so this is George Dean, Rosa and Daisy, George Dean and his wife Rosa. I think that's Rosa's mother. And then up here in the corner, there's a bear. This is a cropped image, but you can see that there's a little bear in a tree. So they lived in Spanaway area and made their life there, complete with their pet. Speaking of bears, do you want to hear a story about the growing up years out of Hudson Bay Company Fort? So one of the stories I got to research when I was doing a children's exhibit for Fort Nisqually was this story of, I think it was Letitia, as a young girl. She traveled with the family, with the, John worked being posted to many different Hudson Bay Company ports. This was up at Fort Simpson, And there was the arrival of a boat, of a canoe. I think it was a canoe full of supplies for the trading post. So young Letitia went out to greet it, very excited. And on the way back to the fort to report the arrival of this supply ship, a bear appeared and started chasing her. So she ran up the hill to the post, the door shut, she was safe. But her slipper was left behind and was a victim of the bear. And turned out this bear was actually a pet of Dr. Kennedy, who was the post surgeon. But you can't have a pet bear chasing young girls. So the bear reportedly was killed and made into a pot of hair grease for young Letitia. So the poor bear paid for his sins.
Claire, I have a question for you. First of all, I wanted to say thank you for sharing, all of your information. I agree with Walter, how you can keep the family tree straight is amazing. And even if you get tangled on a branch here or there, that's certainly a lot of information. And we appreciate you sharing that with us today. The thing that obviously I'm noticing is one of the first things that you point out, many of the women during the 1850s were Native American. And so my question is, when these Native American women married European men, whether they be Hudson's Bay Company employees, Puget Sound Agriculture Company employees, soldiers at Fort Steilacoom, or later the American settlers coming in, were the men then accepted as family into the tribes that these women were from, or were they just simply the husbands of these women?
That's a good question, and I don't really have an answer for it. I can tell you that it did affect perception. So John McLeod, for example, married a Native woman, and then during the Puget Sound Treaty Wars, he was suspect as having sympathies for the Native peoples. So he was actually arrested. It wasn't just that people kind of gave him a side eye, but the government in this area actually took him into custody, and his homestead was burned, as witnessed by young Catherine McLeod. For example, then we have Daniel Mounts. So this is Catherine McLeod Mounts. Catherine grew up and married Daniel. He was an American settler, but he was also like an Indian agent that was working with the Nisqually people. They lived on the Nisqually reservation, and Catherine's descendants had, the benefit of the tribal identity and were on the rolls and that kind of thing. But in terms of like personal relationships and how her family viewed that, I don't actually know. I think it was probably more common in the 30s and 40s when the men were able to be, kind of integrated into the tribal community more, that they were more accepted. But I don't know if they were ever like fully, initiated into the tribe, or it was just kind of, a social acknowledgement.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Joe, yeah, you're still muted.
Sorry, who are we trying to unmute?
Joe.
Joe.
Oh, okay.
Thank you. Thank you. Claire, I got a question for you, sort of facetious, but maybe you can answer it. How come Joseph Heath never could find a wife?
I think he had a bad attitude. He was surrounded by Native Americans, and like the women were coming to his house and just like cook on his fireplace. He just didn't know what was in front of him. That's my bet. He had too many biases and just had a bad attitude about the whole thing. He did not want to be here. He wanted to be at home.
Good. Thank you.
One of the projects I worked on, Tim Farrell, who used to be on the county council, is into history, and he was looking into which of these Hudson Bay husbands were early commissioners in Pierce County. But Sandy Smith, who, or Lyon Smith, he had multiple names there, was one of the 5 that was arrested for treason during the Indian Wars. And his wife, apparently he got drunk and severely beat her often. So this is also something that's really a problem for women, particularly the Native American women of that era, was so many of these men got drunk frequently and were abusive to them. And somehow he got shot, they said, with his own gun. And there's a lot of controversy over who actually shot him, because her family, who were the Indian side, knew how abusive he was. You mentioned the Deans, and she apparently actually married a Fyander as a second husband. And we were trying to straighten out, and it appears that she had 2 children before she married the Fyander, which means Sandy Smith did have children, but they took the Fyander name because she wanted to just erase him. And they ended up as part of the Yakima tribe from what I could see. But first they were out near Silver Lake with the Deans and the Craigers and some of what was out there in the Stringtown area. And I was talking with Jack Gusky, who's also from that area, trying to straighten a little of that out. And he told me I should go talk to his sister because I think they're related. It's pretty fascinating, some of what these families and the stories, what those women went through.
Yes, and I think that's kind of something I've taken away certainly from the study of history, is that customs change and traditions modify over time, but people are still people. And you find the same range of personalities and good and ill, in individuals from any time in history. And so that's kind of, as I think about women in the past, we have, the biased view of what our ancestors tell us women were like or should have been like. Certainly the Victorians had a lot of opinions about that. But if you look into the actual history and the stories, there isn't a woman alive who doesn't have opinions and doesn't make her own choices, no matter when she lived.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Oh, the one piece I didn't get to mention, but I think is interesting as well, is the Hawaiian piece, right? It wasn't just Native Americans and French Canadians and English and Irish and Scottish and Germans who were out here, but the Native Americans often married the Hawaiian employees of the Hudson's Bay Company as well. And for a number of reasons, most of the Hawaiians moved across the border to Canada in the 1840s and 50s. Some of them, like John Kalama, of course, married and stayed with his wife's family and integrated into the local tribes. However, there was also a community up in Salt Spring Islands, just over the border in San Juan Islands, where the Hawaiian employees stayed there and married Native women and had families up there. I wanted to show a picture of one of these women. I'll just go back to my slideshow real quick. Jenny Kahana Nui. Yeah, Jenny Kahana Nui. So we had an employee at Fort Nisqually named Kahana Nui. And the records are a little sketchy, but I believe that this is the same Kahana Nui who then went up to Salt Spring Island and had a family with a slightly different variation of his name. But this is a beautiful picture of Jenny Kahana Nui. And I just thought it's a great example of the diversity that was here and is still here in many ways, and that it was certainly not just the Anglo-Americans or the European Americans who settled these areas. So please enjoy this photo of Jenny and her children. This is courtesy of the Salt Spring Island Archives. They have a great set of documents up there tracing the families, and many of these were Fort Nisqually descendants as well. So fun stories all the way around. I know we're out of time, but just a note to say, again, I owe a lot of this to the work of other women, historians, as well as men historians. So thanks again to all those who did the research, and to people like Mariette, who are still, carrying that research and genealogy on.
Claire, thank you very much for agreeing to speak to us today. And I certainly echo what you've said. There are a number of very talented historians that have pulled together a lot of information on the very rich history of women in the Puget Sound region. And I appreciate what you said at the beginning, that women's history is all of our history. And that couldn't be a better sentiment to share with us today. So thank you very much. And again, thank you to each and every one of you that have supported Historic Fort Steilacoom today by your participation in this program. We do have another presentation that's coming up next week. That is Women's Work in Washington Territory, which will be presented by Tacoma Historical Society's curator, Elizabeth Korsmo. So you'll have an opportunity to learn about day-to-day lives of women in the 1850s and 1860s. So if you haven't registered for that program, please be sure to support Historic Fort Steilacoom and Elizabeth Korsmo by joining in for that presentation next Saturday, March 27th at 2 p.m. And that's about all that I have for today. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Yes, and if you have any questions, my email is out there, ckellerscholz@gmail.com. So don't be afraid to reach out. And if I don't know the answer, I will send you to someone who might have more information.
Thanks,
I added
Claire.
my email in case you have questions for some of my research too.
Perfect. Thank you. All right. Thanks all.